Anyway, boys, love the PlayStation. I'm eating. Purses. There's purses. Oh, let me see the chocolate. There's no support. No one knows what domestic violence is. Jesus people, these racist people, these pedophiles.
exceptional about these small Pennsylvania towns is that they're each almost exactly 10 miles from each other. The distances deviate by no more than a mile from this road. This isn't a coincidence and this isn't planned. Drawing equal-sized radii around each town shows you their spheres of influence. Assuming each town has the exact same shops and services, rational people will go whichever town is closest to buy or sell goods. Towns 10 miles apart mean that nobody has to travel more than 5 miles to reach a town. Each of these towns was founded before the formation of the United States, so that means that farmers and commerce and pretty much everybody walked everywhere. 10 miles, or 5 miles each way, is about the distance a person can comfortably walk in a day with enough time to buy or sell goods at a central market. Back in this era before cars, a 5-mile radius was essentially the largest possible commuter zone to small agricultural towns, and therefore having towns 10 miles apart was the most efficient possible use of rural land. When you get the chance, take a look at a map of a rural area that existed before cars. You'll see that the distance between medium-sized towns is almost always somewhere between about 10 to 15 miles. Because the Cumberland Valley is a valley, towns really could only develop in a line, but in most cases, towns develop in all directions. This is what the 10-mile rule looks like when going out in all directions. Each of these points is a town, and the next one around it is the area from which people will go to the town. In the real world, each of these towns probably has a small grocery store, a pharmacy, a bank, and maybe a restaurant. Since everybody uses these services, there doesn't have to be many people in a town's sphere of influence in order to sustain these shops. But where do you put something more specialized, like a mechanic? People only need to go to the mechanic every once in a while, so you need more people to sustain one mechanic shop than one grocery store. Well, some of these small towns developed into larger towns with more people that can support more specialized shops and services. Putting these larger towns with more specialized shops closer together would be unsustainable, since there wouldn't be enough people going to those shops. But putting them further apart would be inefficient, since there's land that people would not go to a city from. This happens once or twice more until you have cities. These cities have the largest spheres of influence and the most specialized shops. You of course still have grocery stores and pharmacies in cities, but you also have things like luxury car dealerships, brain surgery centers, and airports. The city's sphere of influence is enormous because people will travel hundreds of miles to buy an expensive car or get brain surgery or fly from an airport. Think about it within a city. How far would you walk to buy a latte? Probably only a few blocks. And that's why you see Starbucks or other coffee shops on almost every block. Since almost everyone buys coffee, you only need a few blocks of people to sustain one coffee shop. But how far would you walk to buy a MacBook? Probably quite far, since it's an infrequent and substantial purchase. That's why Apple stores are rather rare even in cities. You need an enormous amount of people to sustain one Apple store, and we can actually figure out roughly how many. In Connecticut, the Trumbull Apple Store is about 20 miles away from the New Haven store to the northeast and the Stamford store to the southwest. In the 10-mile radius around the Trumbull Apple Store, there are about 500,000 inhabitants, which tells us that you need about 500,000 people to sustain one Apple store. We can compare that to the Starbuckses of Lower Manhattan, which are spread out at an average distance of about 600 feet. Drawing a 300-foot radius around one Starbucks in Lower Manhattan covers about 6,000 people, which means that one Starbucks needs 6,000 people to sustain it. Of course, both Connecticut and New York are places with higher than average incomes, which means that less people are needed to sustain one Starbucks or Apple store. The numbers would be very different in, say, rural Kansas. But since each store generally only builds in areas with higher than average incomes, this gives a good sense of how many people Apple and Starbucks look for in an area before opening up a store. So our model shows where cities should be, but it's not like this in reality. This is the most efficient spread of cities. If you're assuming that cities are on a perfectly flat plane with no geographic features, no social influences, no variability of income, equal distribution of resources, essentially assuming the world is one homogeneous place, which it's not. In reality, of course, our world has an enormous effect on where and why cities develop. To start out, let's cut this down to one city on a flat, featureless plane for simplicity. What affects the location of cities more than anything is water. If we put an ocean on one side of our isotropic plane, our city will almost certainly locate near it. Oceans have always been and still are what connects the world. There's no other means of transport that can move such enormous amounts of cargo for so little. Any city needs to be economically efficient to grow, and it will cost more to bring goods to a city that's 1,000 miles inland than one right by the ocean. Just look at Europe. 6 of the 10 largest European cities are within 100 miles of the coast, but oceans aren't the only bodies of water to affect cities. Rivers are just as, or perhaps even more influential. Milan, the 19th largest European city, is the largest to not be either directly on the ocean or on a river, and even then, it's only 15 miles from a river and 75 miles from the ocean. Until the last century or so, cities could not survive without direct water access. If you need more proof, 14 of the 15 largest cities in the world are within a few dozen miles of the ocean. Perhaps the most obvious attractor for cities is resources. So going back to our isotropic plane, putting natural resources anywhere on this map will draw cities near it. Cities that existed before the last century or so generally sprung up right near the resources, much like Pittsburgh, since they acted as manufacturing and transportation hubs for those resources. But more recently, new resource-dependent cities don't need to be as close to the resources themselves. New transportation technologies can bring the resources from their source. Just look at Dubai. Of course, the UAE has enormous oil deposits, but they're much closer to Abu Dhabi and the southwest than Dubai. In 1900, Dubai had 10,000 residents, less than half that of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, one of the farming towns we talked about at the beginning. That only grew to 40,000 by 1960, but today it's known worldwide and has more than 2.5 million residents. It was able to grow at this enormous rate, even faster than Abu Dhabi, since it cemented itself as the economic and administrative hub for the oil industries of the region. Another geographic feature that we can add to the plain is mountains. Now, mountains don't always have a uniform effect on cities. Mexico City, Bogota, and Addis Ababa are all enormous cities at elevations above 7,000 feet. Mountains do make transport and trade difficult, but they also provide protection. Many ancient cities grew in these locations since they were easy to protect, which left more time to focus on growing the city. But mountains can also hinder development. For quite a while, the United States could not develop west of the Appalachian Mountains. They just served as an enormous barrier. In 1800, the average center of population for the entire United States was here, even though the US had sovereignty over this entire area. Of course, technology eventually conquered this barrier and moved the mean population center all the way out to Missouri today. But if the Appalachian Mountains didn't exist, American history and geography would be completely different. We would have seen urban development much earlier in the Midwest. But mountains can also have another effect. You see, coal, silver, gold, and other mineral deposits are all often located in mountainous regions. And just like Dubai, cities can develop in less hospitable and easy places due to resources. The economic advantage of exploiting the resources overpowers the economic disadvantage of being in an inhospitable location. Denver, Colorado grew 650% between 1870 and 1880 with the opening of a railroad branch connecting with the Transcontinental Railroad. It served as an access point to transportation to the gold miners in the Rockies. So, mountains can either push cities away or bring them nearer. It really just depends on the circumstance. Let's exchange our isotropic plane for a world map. Where should cities be on here? Well, our world's cities are not necessarily in all the most geographically efficient locations. While there is a certain level of natural selection that grows the efficiently placed cities and shrinks the inefficiently placed cities, humans are not always able to put cities in the most efficient locations. Let's put up the 224 cities in the world with a population over 2 million. You can immediately see some patterns. Putting up the equator, you can see there's a clear divide. Only 32 of these cities lie in the southern hemisphere. One might think that this is because there's so much more land in the northern hemisphere, but that's not entirely true. You see, the southern hemisphere still has 32% of the world's land, but only has 14% of the world's large cities. There's clearly a higher density of cities in the northern hemisphere. You can pretty much trace this all back to Europe and Asia. The first large civilizations and empires were on these two continents, even though the human race likely originated in Africa. There's hundreds of different theories on why civilizations succeeded in some places and failed in others.
Dare to smell hair. Enjoy smooth skin with our new and improved formula that smells amazing. Just apply a generous layer of cream on clean skin and set your timer for 10 minutes. Then, wipe away the cream and rinse thoroughly with water. Dermatologist tested and incredibly easy to use. Say hello to blade-free skin that stays smooth days longer than shaving.
Hello there. I'm here to show you one.
But one of the more plausible and interesting theories is that Europe and Asia succeeded because they're wide instead of tall. The very shape of continents may have changed the course of human history. You see, when a continent is wide, you have a ton of land with roughly the same climate. Climate tends to change when you move north and south rather than east and west, as a nature of how the Earth rotates around the sun. Much of the success of early civilizations had to do with the domestication of plants and animals and the corresponding technology. When expanding horizontally, the climate is similar enough that an empire can use the same successful plants and animals, while expanding vertically requires the domestication of new plants and animals. If a civilization started in Central America, for example, there would be very little land on the continent with a similar climate, and their expansion would be severely limited. In Europe and Asia, on the other hand, there's thousands upon thousands of miles of similar climate that can be reached Bangladesh just by traveling east or west. Just look at the maps of the four largest early empires: the Qing Dynasty, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, and the Mongol Empire. They were all in Eurasia, and they all expanded horizontally. When some of the more modern empires expanded, they had the technology to do so overseas. The three major modern empires were the British, Spanish, and French empires, each of which came from relatively similar climates. A major reason why America was able to succeed is because all the agriculture from Europe worked there. Climatically, Europe and America are nearly identical. The majority of developed colonized countries are in the northern hemisphere just because they were closest to Europe. But formerly British countries like South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand are all highly developed and in the southern hemisphere. Their success over more northern countries in the southern hemisphere can also be partially attributed to their greater climate similarity to Europe. Let's ask one more question. If our world only had one city, where would it logically be? Well, if you take the location of every person in the world and average it out, you come to South Central Asia. That means that this general region is the optimal place to live on the planet. But where, more specifically, should our world city go? Well, this region is already in the northern hemisphere and in Eurasia, so we've already covered those two criteria. We want a place within 100 or so miles of the ocean, on a navigable river, near mountains with rich mineral deposits. The single best place for a city on Earth just might be Dhaka, Bangladesh. Every geographic model and theory says that there's no better place on Earth to put a city than here. There's evidence to back this up. Dhaka is between the 4th and the 18th largest metropolitan area on Earth, depending on how you define metropolitan area, and Bangladesh is the 6th densest country on Earth. There are 161 million people living in an area of about the size of England. History has affected geography enough that the largest and most advanced civilizations are not all in South Central Asia. But if we started all over again, did humanity a second time, every geographic model says that this region could be the origin and central point of human civilization. I hope you enjoyed this Wendover Productions video. This video was made possible by my amazing, brand new sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform to make your beautiful professional website. Months before Squarespace signed on to sponsor Wendover Productions, I used them to make my website, wendoverproductions.com. Now, I wasn't looking for anything fancy. I just wanted to make sure that nobody else could get their hands on the wendoverproductions.com domain, and also to create a great-looking landing page. This way, I could give people one link that goes to all my different social accounts. I know that most of you guys are smart, upstart, entrepreneurial people that want to make your mark. And what's so much more professional than a LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook account is a standalone website, and it's cheaper than you'd think. Especially because if you sign up using the link squarespace.com/Wendover and use the code Wendover in your order, you'll get 10% off. This is hopefully the beginning of a long and prosperous relationship between Wendover Productions and Squarespace. They're really committed to helping independent creators like me and perhaps you make great things. So definitely take a look at what they have to offer and make your next move with Squarespace. You can support Wendover Productions by contributing on Patreon, where 100% of the funds go right back into the channel. I even release expense reports at the end of each month. You can also get great rewards over there, like early access to videos, stickers, handwritten letters.
Big sliced and flour dusted, nature's own perfectly crafted bread. You're fancy now.
Money makes the world go round. Crypto makes the world go forward.
This is Detroit, a previously wealthy city that has now become the poster child for the places that economic prosperity has left behind. The story of Detroit's decline from an economic powerhouse to a city where roughly 35% of its residents live below the poverty line is so well documented that we'll receive very little value from rehashing it here. To oversimplify a ridiculously complex story, Detroit used to have one of the strongest auto manufacturing industries in the world. Competition from foreign manufacturing plants suddenly made Detroit an unattractive destination for building cars. As jobs in the car manufacturing industry became scarce, Detroit was unable to pivot to higher value industries that could sustain its economy. And when the jobs left, the people that could leave Detroit did. Detroit's population today is about 1/3 of its population at its peak. But Detroit isn't the only city that has had a hard time attracting new residents. In fact, scientists estimate that 25% of cities across the world saw their populations decline between 2013 and 2018. They also predict that the number of shrinking cities will grow to roughly 37% of all cities between 2018 and 2050. The people with the means to leave will always leave. However, the people who are forced to stay will find themselves in a city that offers poor public services, few job opportunities, and the social problems that come with them. To avoid becoming the next Detroit, cities across the globe are rushing to implement policies to attract new residents. These policies range from the boring, think tax breaks or fancy amenities, to the more creative. For instance, many rural areas in Japan are offering free homes to attract new residents. But maybe the push for new residents is misplaced. The fact is that not every city can be a growing city. The United Nations estimates that the global population will stabilise by 2100. If you live in New York, Toronto or San Francisco, then you might think that your city could never become a shrinking city. And you might be right. But of course, mid-20th century Detroiters believed that as well. So, what is the history of shrinking cities? Why do shrinking cities have a bad reputation? And finally, can shrinking cities become economic miracles? This episode of Economics Explained is brought to you by Blinkist. Blinkist is a tool designed to deliver concise knowledge perfect for the time-conscious learner. The app distills over 5,500 non-fiction books and podcasts into 15-minute blinks, catering to diverse. Suggest this blink to you. Get 25% off Blinkist Premium and start your 7-day free trial by clicking the link. Ruin. Urban planners refocus their efforts from promoting city shrinkage to promoting city growth. But why do shrinking cities have a bad reputation? Most cities gain revenue through two channels: property taxes and funding from higher levels of government. In some countries, municipalities can sell bonds or levy income taxes, but this isn't common practice everywhere. When a population shrinks, the property taxes that the city government receives shrink also, for two reasons. First and most obvious, fewer people means fewer homes to tax. Second and less obvious, fewer people reduces the demand for housing, which lowers the property value for existing homes. And because the property tax is a percentage of a house's value, the total amount paid by current homeowners falls too. As the total taxes that Detroit receives from properties has fallen, it has been forced to increase its tax rate to make up the shortfall. Today, Detroit has one of the highest effective property tax rates in the United States, which adds another layer of difficulty to persuade people to move to Detroit. Government funding is the second source of revenue for cities, and because government funding is usually tied with a city's population size, shrinking cities tend to see their government funds dwindle as their residents leave. In 2022, Detroit launched a legal challenge against the US Census Bureau for underreporting Detroit's population. According to Detroit's lawsuit, the Bureau undercounting threatens millions of dollars of funding which Detroiters are entitled. So city shrinkage creates revenue shrinkage. But a small revenue isn't by itself a problem. Many small towns do well even without a New York-sized budget. The problem occurs when cities with a dwindling tax revenue are expected to service the same area as when their tax revenue was much higher. Since 1926, Detroit has been responsible for 139 square miles, despite its dwindling population. Compare that with, say, San Francisco, which has a population of 815,000 residents, but an area of only 46 square miles. However, San Francisco projects that the total funds it will receive in the 2022-2023 fiscal year will be close to $14 billion, whereas Detroit projects that those funds will sum to around $2.5 billion. This translates to $14 million per square mile in revenue for Detroit, but $280 million per square mile in revenue for San Francisco. It is much easier for San Francisco to service its 46 square miles than it is for Detroit to service their 139 square miles. That Detroit must service the same land area despite its shrinking tax revenue makes maintaining infrastructure and city services especially challenging. This often leads to damaged infrastructure, abandoned buildings, and poor public services. Damaged infrastructure makes it difficult to attract new companies, abandoned buildings often attract more crime, and poor public services incentivise current residents to move to cities where their services are better. The second issue with city shrinkage is employment shrinkage. When populations decline, fewer residents are able to perform the duties that local companies demand. This forces companies to relocate, possibly to the city where their former workforce is gone. The residents remaining in a shrinking city are also usually older and less educated than the ones with the means to leave. This makes attracting companies challenging because the city lacks the human capital that companies need to grow. These types of shrinkages in revenue and in job opportunities makes a difficult situation even worse. Those who remain in a shrinking city tend to be low-income households who are more reliant on city resources than those who left. Because a lot of tax revenue must be spent on caring for low-income households, there is little left over to reinvest into the city. So while public infrastructure and investments to attract new residents are neglected, urban decline worsens, which means more money must be funneled into social services, and so the spiral continues. As a result, the shrinking city falls into a shrinking trap that is difficult to escape despite their best efforts. But can shrinking cities become economic miracles? With all the potential harm that comes from shrinkage, it's no wonder that many cities are trying to buck the trend. In 2011, 3 of Detroit's largest employers in Midtown, just north of downtown Detroit, implemented an incentive program called Live Midtown to attract new residents and retain the residents already there. The incentives included rental assistance, forgivable loans for a down payment on a house, and a home renovation allowance. The program succeeded. From 2011 to 2015, Live Midtown is credited with attracting 1,000 residents to the area. This is in spite of the fact that Detroit has still lost residents during that time. It also seems that a diverse population took advantage of the subsidies that Live Midtown offered. Gentrification has always been a concern amongst Detroit residents as companies and policymakers attempt to revitalise the city. Policies will have to be well thought out to ensure that they benefit as many groups as possible. But there's also a question of if incentives will work for every shrinking city. Take rural areas in Japan, for instance. Japan has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. Japan also has some of the lowest levels of immigration amongst developed countries. Providing cheap homes is a good way to attract residents from other parts of Japan, but this doesn't do shrinking cities in Japan much good when the country's entire population is shrinking. Cities competing with each other for a limited number of total residents does not solve the underlying issues of low fertility rates coupled with low immigration. Of course, cities have no say in a country's immigration policies. Yes, incentives like loan forgiveness programs and free homes can be helpful, but they may have unintended consequences. We also shouldn't expect them to work in the long run for shrinking cities where shrinkage is due to factors outside of that city's control. But maybe we don't need to reverse the trend of shrinking cities in the first place. The reality is, shrinking cities are here to stay. Rather than accepting that city shrinkage is linked to economic decline, we can instead consider ways for a city to prosper even with a declining population. When we think of population decline, we tend to think of economic ruin, but the two don't always go hand in hand. In fact, New Orleans is a great example of the two diverging. According to a 2019 paper, 27% of the 886 shrinking cities in the United States between 1980 and 2010 had median incomes higher than their regional average. Also, 97% of these prosperous shrinking cities had a higher proportion of residents with at least a bachelor's degree than their regional average. This same study also finds no significant relationship between income and the severity of city shrinkage. These statistics might be head-scratching at first, but they actually make a lot of sense. Some residents may be attracted to shrinking cities for the same reason that others are repelled by them. For instance, shrinking cities have much less road congestion than dense cities. And yes, shrinking cities can create many vacant homes, but this makes the remaining homes more affordable for new residents. Now, all of this isn't to put lipstick on a pig. The issues with shrinking cities that we mentioned before, shrinking tax revenues and a shrinking supply of jobs, still stand. But the point here is to push urban planners to leverage the advantages that shrinking cities have over growing cities. When we look at city shrinkage through that lens, then we can start to think about smart shrinkage. In a nutshell, smart shrinkage is the idea that policymakers should build for less. Instead of building more homes in the hopes of attracting people, convert empty residential areas into green spaces accessible to everyone. Instead of constructing more roads, channel more of their funds into maintaining the infrastructure that they had previously neglected. Of course, not every shrinking city can be successful, just like not every growing city can be successful. Although a quarter of shrinking cities in the United States are performing better than their peers, that still leaves 3/4 of shrinking cities trailing behind.
wonder why these don't have a, what do you call it? A motion stabilizer? I don't know. See, what is it? Oh, city, no, Japan doesn't. That's, alright, see, wait a minute.